أصبح بصوتك أسمع الأكوان اقرأ كلام الله داوي نفوسنا لنحس في أعماقنا الإيمان كالحجارة قسوة فإذا عن القرآن حين لانا
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين، على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين، وصلى الله وسلم على جميع الأنبياء والمرسلين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to another episode in our series Reflections on the Qur'an. We've been discussing the methodology of Tafseer, and we've been talking at considerable length about Tafseer of the Qur'an by the Qur'an. One of the aspects of that is cross-referencing, that a word is used here and the same word is used there in a different passage, and can you refer from one passage to the other in order to determine a meaning of the word in a situation where a word has more than one meaning. And in some cases it's quite clear. We have that example of the Prophet ﷺ where he explained that dhulm in a certain verse, the Sahaba understood it to mean the general linguistic meaning, which is wrongdoing, and he explained that no, it's the meaning of dhulm that was in this verse in Surah Luqman, which means shirk. Now, this principle has to be used with discernment. It's not a cookbook kind of following the recipe, an algorithm where you just look here and there and you see the word and then you say, well, it's used here to mean this, so it must mean that in this context. And we started discussing, and we finished almost, discussing an example that was mentioned by Sheikh Ahmed Farhat, the professor of Tafseer at Imam Muhammad Saud University and later University of Sharjah, now retired. He was talking about this issue of Tafseer of the Qur'an by the Qur'an and how just a surface reading and a comparison may not be accurate. So we're talking about the verse in Surah Al-Qasas, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم ونزعنا من كل أمة شهيدا فقلنا هاتوا برهانكم فعلموا أن الحق لله وضل عنهم ما كانوا يفترون. Now, the translation that I'm using really doesn't reflect the meaning of the word naza'na, but I'll just read it as it has been translated by one of the respected translators of Qur'an. If I recall correctly, this translation is that of Abdul Halim. The translation runs, we shall call a witness from every ummah. Ummah is a community. The technical meaning is those to whom a prophet was sent. We shall call a witness from every ummah and say, produce your evidence. And then they will know that the truth belongs to Allah alone. So the question that Sheikh Ahmed Farhat was raising here was, who is the witness that's being referred to? And some said that it's a prophet of each ummah, based upon the use of the word shaheed, witness, in a verse in Surah An-Nisa, addressing the Prophet ﷺ. فَكَيْفَ إِذَا جِئْنَا مِنْ كُلِّ أُمَّةٍ بِشَهِيدٍ وَجِئْنَا بِكَ عَلَى هَؤُلَاءِ شَهِيدًا. But how will it be with them when we bring of every people a witness, and we bring you, O Muhammad ﷺ, a witness against these? Now, Sheikh Ahmed Farhat explained why this is not a very tenable explanation based on the clues from that verse in Surah Al-Qasas. First of all, the word naza'na means to extract, pull with force. And it's used in Surah An-Nazi'at to refer to the extraction of the souls. I mean, that's the tafsir of Ali radiallahu anh. The meaning of the first verse in Surah An-Nazi'at, that it refers to extract, the angels extracting the souls of disbelievers. And in a hadith, that process was mentioned to be similar to pulling wet wool through a thorn bush. So at every thorn it sticks. So the soul of the disbeliever, he knows at this point that he's being dragged out to punishment, and so the soul is resisting leaving the body. So this sense of being pulled with force, that is not appropriate. It doesn't befit the way that Allah treats the prophets. You know, they're His most respected creation. Another clue is that once this shaheed has been pulled out of each ummah, they are told, Hatu burhanakum, bring your evidence. And everywhere that this phrase is used in the Qur'an, it's always a challenge to people who are putting forward some specious claim, a false claim, and they're being challenged to produce your evidence. So again, the usage of this term throughout the Qur'an is always in the context of a challenge to someone who's in a state of falsehood. And that was the stronger of the evidence. He now moves to a weaker point of evidence, but it's still not what you call ta'assuf. Ta'assuf is like straining the evidence to make it fit. Of course, there are places in the Qur'an where shaheed is used in an honorable context, but there's also places in the Qur'an where it's used in a negative connotation. In Surah Al-Baqarah, وَإِن كُنتُمْ فِي رَيْبٍ مِّمَّا نَزَّلْنَا عَلَىٰ عَبْدِنَا فَأْتُوا بِسُورَةٍ مِّن مِّثْلِهِ وَادْعُوا شُهَدَاءَكُم مِّن دُونِ اللَّهِ إِن كُنتُمْ صَادِقِينَ. So these people who deny that the Qur'an is from Allah, they're being challenged to bring their witnesses to testify to the truth of what they're claiming. So these witnesses that they're being challenged to produce, if they were to witness on their behalf, they would be witnesses to falsehood. It's called in Islam shahadatu zur, bearing false testimony. And this is, one of the worst things that a person can do. Now, this is what we talked about in the previous show. One final piece of evidence, which we didn't have a chance to get to in the last show, that there's another verse where the word naza'a, to pluck, to draw forth with force, that it's being used to refer to the extraction of the leaders of a group of kafirs. Allah says, بَعْدَ أَعُوذُ بِاللَّهِ مِنَ الشَّيْطَانِ الرَّجِيمِ ثُمَّ لَنَنزِعَنَّ مِنْ كُلِّ شِيعَةٍ أَيُّهُمْ أَشَدُّ عَلَى الرَّحْمَنِ إِتِيًّا. And what that means, this is from Surah Maryam, then we will pluck out from every sect whichever of them was most stubborn in rebellion to the most merciful. So the parallel usage of naza'a, pulling out from every Shia. Shia is a group and Ummah is a group. So the meaning of the verse then, the most likely meaning of the verse, is that the witnesses being referred to here in Surah Al-Qasas are the leaders of kufr in each ummah. So the point of going into the detailed explanation or investigation of this particular verse is that you can't just have this one-size-fits-all automatic process of applying tafsir of the Qur'an by the Qur'an. Now, the next issue related to tafsir of the Qur'an by the Qur'an is that one has to look at the passage as a whole in which a particular word or a statement occurs in order to be sure that the interpretation of this particular verse is in line with the greater context, the theme of the passage, the objectives of the passage. Now, one of the drawbacks or a point upon which many classical tafsirs can be criticized is that there is a tendency to look at each verse by itself. I mean, that's the way your standard tafsir is set up. Okay, here's verse number 1, let's discuss that. Okay, let's move on to verse number 2, let's discuss that. The words in this one mean this, and this is the point of this verse. Sometimes that extreme zoom in the text causes a loss of the sense of what the whole passage is about. And that was an issue that some of the latter-day tafseers, comparatively latter-day, began to deal with. So Fakhr Razi, one of the famous mufassirs, his tafsir is considered one of the great ones. Okay, let's talk about him when we come back. It's time for a break.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'm Dr. Bilal Phillips, and you're watching Peace TV.
ولله الأسماء الحسنى فادعوه بها
Al-Aziz, the Almighty. Al-Wadud, the All-Loving. At-Tawwab, the Acceptor of your return. Al-Razzaq, the Provider. Al-Raqib, the All-Watchful. وَلِلَّهِ الْأَسْمَاءُ الْحُسْنَى. To Allah belongs the beautiful names. فَادْعُوهُ بِهَا. So call Him upon them. To understand more of Allah's beautiful names, join me, your brother Majid Mahmood, on my new series about understanding Allah's beautiful names on Peace TV.
الله لا إله إلا هو له الأسماء الحسنى.
Don't miss the chance to comprehend the seamless explanation of Allah's beautiful names in Understanding Allah's Beautiful Names. Every Saturday at 8 p.m. and repeat telecast at 11:30 a.m. India on Peace TV.
I am a Muslim, so are you.
In these times of ignorance and confusion, we have never been more in need of holding on firmly to our Islamic belief.
What is Islam? What is Islam?
Those simple things that define you as a Muslim, and teaching them to our families and our children.
Now do you know?
Join me, Muhammad Tim Humble, as we go back to basics in the basics of a Muslim's belief.
Polish your personality in the light of divine wisdom to live like a true Muslim in the basics of a Muslim's belief. Every Wednesday at 8 p.m. and repeat telecast at 11:30 a.m. India on Peace TV.
Confused, worried, losing control. If you are a parent, these feelings may well be all too familiar. In a society in which we increasingly feel that we are losing our children, it's still possible to get it right. And Islam will show you how. Want to know more? Join me, Muhammad Tim Humble, as we explore the ways to be a good Muslim parent.
Learn a series of beautiful Islamic techniques to help our children get the best in this world and the best in the hereafter in 26 Ways to be a Good Muslim Parent. Next on Peace TV.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Welcome back. So we're starting to talk about Fakhr al-Razi. He was a sort of a pioneer in reversing the atomistic approach to tafsir, where the mufassir looks at each verse completely independently of the other verses in the passage. So one of the aspects of his methodology, Razi's methodology, was to discuss the relationship of the surah, the beginning of the surah. We talk about its relationship with the surah before it and the surah after it. And when he discussed many verses, he would also set them in context and relate them to what had come before and perhaps what's coming after. So that was part of his concern. I mean, there's a famous mufassir, who's not nearly as famous as al-Razi, al-Biqa'i, who was a teacher of Ibn Hajar Asqalani, the famous hadith scholar, imam in hadith. His teacher al-Biqa'i, he wrote a tafsir. The central focus of his tafsir was pointing out the relationship between surahs and between verses within a surah. And in the contemporary era, I mean, there's a school, particularly in India, that's famous for this. The scholar Amin Islahi, I believe his name is, Tadabbur al-Qur'an. And he was continuing an approach that was pioneered by his teacher and perhaps the teacher before him. Of course, Tadabbur al-Qur'an is not in English. Perhaps one volume has been translated from Urdu into English. But Islahi's student, Mustansir Mir, the last time I heard, he was a professor of Islamic studies at a university in Youngstown, Ohio. He wrote a book a couple of decades ago called Coherence in the Qur'an in English, where he discusses, it's a fairly small book, but it's quite a valuable book, where he discusses the themes which organize surahs, pairs of surahs, groups of surahs. What that highlights, and what he was making a point of highlighting, was that there's a common perception of the Qur'an or criticism of the Qur'an among Orientalists particularly, that this book has absolutely no order. It's just like always rambling on, changing topics. There's no structure. There's actually a structure, but it's subtle, and it's something that one perceives from repeated reading. Yeah, if you read it once or twice, really you're not going to understand the structure at all. Repeated reading and contemplation begins to reveal to the reader the structure of this book. And for instance, Surah Al-Baqarah, which is the longest surah and seems to shift its topic very frequently, various scholars have looked at that and demonstrated that there are these wide themes that organize the surah. So now let's move to our next point in the methodology of tafsir of the Qur'an by the Sunnah. Now, we already pointed out that narration where the Sahaba came to the Prophet ﷺ to clear up for them the misgivings or the anxiety that they had based upon their linguistic understanding of a verse, and that he cleared it up for them. Another example of a hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ explicitly made tafsir of a Quranic verse, in the verse in Surah Al-Anfal, وَأَعِدُّ لَهُمْ مَا اسْتَطَعْتُم مِّن قُوَّةٍ, prepare for them what you're able to of strength or force. He was giving a khutbah in which he pointed out that the meaning of quwwah or force there, he said it's rami, shooting. So that's a famous example that's frequently quoted. The point about hadiths related to tafsir, however, is that explicit tafsir by the Prophet ﷺ of a particular verse, where he said, regarding this verse, this is what it means, that only occurred with regard to a relatively small number of verses. If you look at Sahih al-Bukhari, there's one volume of his hadith collection which is devoted to tafsir, and in the English translation, the vast majority of volume 6, I believe, relates to tafsir of different verses. And I think, if I recall, there's about 600 plus hadiths in that kitab? Well, there's something more than 6,200 verses in the whole Qur'an, so that's really a small minority of the verses, less than, or roughly 10% perhaps. So there are other hadiths in which the Prophet ﷺ wasn't explicitly referring to a verse and saying, well, this verse means that. But the hadith will be about a topic that's relevant to a given verse. So based upon the perception of a given mufassir, he will mention a given hadith in discussing a given ayah because he sees, okay, there's a relationship here. And of course, for those hadiths to be given consideration in tafsir, they have to be authentic. One of the features that we see in a lot of classical tafsirs is a reliance upon weak hadiths. And one of the most notorious areas related to that is where the scholar will start by talking about the virtues of a given surah. And very few of those hadiths are authentic. In fact, there was a particular scholar, his name cropping up in these isnads of hadiths about the particular virtue of a particular surah. And hadith scholars eventually came to him and challenged him and said, how is it that nobody else is narrating these hadiths except you? And he said, well, I only meant good thereby. He'd made up these hadiths in order to encourage people to read the Qur'an. He said, I saw people being diverted into studying the fiqh of Abu Hanifa and the seerah of, Fulan, and so I wanted to bring them back to the Qur'an. So he was making up these hadiths about the virtues of surahs. So, I mean, that's a real foolish thing to do, because you get yourself in deep trouble with Allah to attribute statements to the Prophet ﷺ that he didn't make. Now, another area of importance in tafsir is the statements of the Sahaba regarding the meaning of a verse. And the Sahabi that you hear most often, who is most often cited regarding an opinion about a verse, is Abdullah ibn Abbas. Now, Abdullah ibn Abbas was only about 13 when the Prophet ﷺ died, and he was living in Mecca for a good portion of the time that the Prophet ﷺ was in Medina. So he didn't have much contact with him until the last 3 years of the life of the Prophet ﷺ. So how is it that Abdullah bin Abbas is such an authority? It's because he compiled the knowledge of the elder Sahaba. And there are stories told about him that he went to visit one of the Ansar, and the Ansar happened to be taking a nap. His family informed Ibn Abbas that the master of the house was asleep. So Abdullah bin Abbas, he just took up, he sat down outside the man's house. Everybody in those days, they have a wall around the house. So he found himself a spot in the shade, and he waited until the man woke up. And that Ansari man, when he found out that the cousin of the Prophet ﷺ was outside, he came hurrying out. He said, why didn't you say something? You should have asked them to wake me up. And Abdullah bin Abbas said, well, I came to you seeking knowledge, so the etiquette associated with that is to respect the person from whom you're seeking the knowledge, and I didn't want to disturb you. And in a famous statement, people asked Abdullah bin Abbas, how is it that you learned so much and surpassed your contemporaries among the younger Sahaba and the people of his age in seeking knowledge? And he said, Lisanun sa'ul wa qalbun aqul. He said, I asked a lot of questions. My tongue was constantly questioning. My heart was thinking, aqul. So he had this understanding. Of course, there's a famous hadith where the Prophet ﷺ, after the Prophet ﷺ came out of the bathroom one day, and he found a jug of water there for his ablution. And he said, who put that there? And they said, Abdullah ibn Abbas. So he made dua for him. Allahumma allimhu at-ta'wil wa faqihhu fi ad-din. Okay, we've come to the end of this episode. Inshallah, we'll pick up in the next episode. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Allahu a'lam.
اقرأ وخيّا